December 18th, 1944, shortly after 11 in the morning. The temperature in the Belgian Ardennes had not climbed above freezing in days. Ice coated the roads. Fog sat thick in the valley of the Amblève River. And in the small market town of Trois Ponts, whose name means three bridges, a company of American soldiers was doing something that had nothing to do with fighting in any conventional sense. They were rigging explosives to the underside of a bridge. On the road east of town, closing fast, was Kampfgruppe Peiper, Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's armoured battle group. Roughly 4,800 men, over 100 tanks including the formidable King Tiger, and around 800 vehicles in total. It was one of the most powerful armoured columns in the entire German military. In December 1944, Peiper had been given a route, a timetable, and a destination. The Meuse River, to be reached in 2 days. The bridge at Trois Ponts was on his route. He needed it intact. Every minute of delay cost him fuel, daylight, and distance. He did not get it. At shortly after 11 in the morning, as Peiper's lead Panther tank came rolling into view at the railway underpass east of the Amblève Bridge, the engineers of Company C of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion blew the span. The explosion shook the valley walls. The bridge dropped into the river. Peiper, riding in his command vehicle, watched it go. He would be forced to detour north toward Cheneux. He would lose hours he could not recover. And what happened at Trois Ponts that morning would happen again and again in the hours and days that followed. At the Lienne Creek Bridge near Habimont, at the crossing near Werbermont, along every valley road that led west toward the Meuse. Everywhere Peiper turned, the bridges were gone. In his post-war memoir, and in the oral tradition of the American engineers who stopped him, a phrase was recorded that captured the frustration of the most feared armoured commander on the Western Front in December 1944. It was attributed to Peiper when he learned what had been done to him, who had done it, and why his drive to the Meuse had failed. The phrase, as Janice Holt Giles recorded it in her 1970 book, and as Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion later confirmed in his memoir, was this: "Those damned engineers." To understand why those words carried such weight, you first have to understand who and what the American combat engineers of the Ardennes actually were. They were not a passive support force. The United States Army Combat Engineer Battalions of World War II were trained to do two completely opposite things with equal skill: build and destroy, create and annihilate. They constructed bridges under fire and demolished bridges under fire. They cleared minefields and planted minefields. They built roads through forests and cratered those same roads to stop an enemy from using them. They were expected to do all of this while trained and armed as infantry, and in many cases while being shot at. By December 1944, the American Army had a dense network of engineer units embedded throughout the European theatre. In the Ardennes sector specifically, a handful of those units would prove decisive. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was perhaps the most consequential. It was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin, a 27-year-old civil engineering graduate from Pennsylvania who had led his battalion across France and into Belgium since before the Normandy landings. His men had spent the weeks before the German offensive doing what engineers always do in the quiet periods of a war. They were repairing roads, running sawmills, winterizing supply routes, fixing culverts. They were spread across a wide area of central Belgium, not concentrated, not positioned to fight a battle, doing unglamorous logistical work that kept the Allied army moving. There was also the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, with companies in and around Trois Ponts. There were platoons from the 299th Engineer Combat Battalion, the 202nd, and smaller engineer detachments attached to infantry divisions across the entire sector. None of them were at full strength. None had been briefed on the possibility of a German offensive. In December 1944, the Ardennes was a rest area, a quiet sector. There was no reason to be ready for a fight. That was about to change. To fully appreciate what those engineers accomplished in December 1944, you have to understand something about the ground itself. The Ardennes is not the open farmland of northern France. It is a dense, heavily forested plateau, cut through by steep river valleys and narrow gorges, served by roads that twist between ridgelines and drop into ravines before climbing out the other side. In winter, with ice on the roads and snow in the forest, It becomes one of the most difficult pieces of terrain in Western Europe for armoured vehicles to operate in. A tank column cannot simply drive across fields when the fields are frozen marshes and the forests are too dense to navigate. It must use the roads. And in the Ardennes, the roads follow the rivers, and the rivers are crossed at bridges. This was the terrain the German planners chose for their last great offensive in the west, Operation Wacht am Rhine, which the Allies would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. And the entire plan rested on a single operational requirement: speed. The German armoured columns had to move so fast that the American army could not recover from the initial shock. They had to reach the Meuse River within 48 hours. They had to cross it before Allied reserves could be brought up, before Allied air power could intervene, before the fuel ran out and the initiative passed back to the other side. That speed depended entirely on bridges, because in the Ardennes in December, if you cannot cross a river at a bridge, you often cannot cross it at all. The Amblève, the Salm, the Aout, the Lienne, these rivers run through valleys with steep, soft banks that are impassable to tanks except at established crossing points. Every bridge was therefore a bottleneck, a place where an armoured column stretching for miles along a single road had to funnel through a single passage, one tank at a time. The German commanders who planned Wacht am Rhine understood this, and so, crucially, did the American engineers. What those engineers did in December 1944 was not merely a military action. It was a demonstration of something that generals and historians sometimes overlook when telling the story of the Battle of the Bulge. The battle was not won only by the paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne, or by General Patton's relief column driving north through the snow, or by the infantry divisions that held the shoulders of the German breakthrough. It was won in significant and decisive part by men who understood demolitions, who understood terrain, and who understood that a bridge, once destroyed at the right moment, was a problem that no amount of German firepower could immediately solve. By the autumn of 1944, most senior Allied commanders had persuaded themselves that Germany was nearly finished. Paris had been liberated in August. The Siegfried Line had been breached. The German army had been shattered in the Falaise pocket and had retreated across France in disorder. Allied armies were pressing toward the German border from the North Sea to Switzerland. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the prevailing mood, if not quite triumphant, was one of cautious optimism. The war in Europe was a matter of when, not if. Against that backdrop, the Ardennes sector was used as a rest area, a place to send divisions that had been mauled in fighting elsewhere, to recover and refit. The sector was held by Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps, spread across a frontage far wider than doctrine recommended. The 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for only days. The 28th Infantry Division was still recovering from the catastrophic losses it had suffered in the Hurtgen forest just weeks before. Intelligence warnings existed, ultra-signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations all pointed toward unusual German activity behind the lines. But the consensus at Allied headquarters was that Germany lacked the strength for a major offensive. The evidence was filtered through the lens of what commanders expected to see, rather than what was actually there. What was actually there was 3 German armies. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, the 6th Panzer Army, under SS General Sepp Dietrich in the north. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel in the centre. The 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger in the south. Over 200,000 men. Roughly 600 tanks and assault guns in the opening assault force, with more to follow. All of it hidden behind the Siegfried Line under extraordinary discipline and strict radio silence, waiting in the forests of the Eifel. On the night of December 15th into December 16th, 1944, none of that was known with any certainty on the Allied side. Soldiers along the front went to sleep, believing the morning would bring another quiet day. Engineer battalions finished their shifts and turned in. The sentries stamped their feet against the cold. Then, at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, and everything changed. In the hours before those guns fired, the men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion were scattered across a wide stretch of central Belgium, doing what engineers do when nobody is shooting at them. Some were in billets in Haute-Bordeaux and Werbemont. Others were in Trois-Ponts itself, the small market town that sat where the Amblève and Salm rivers met, crossed by 3 bridges. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin had a command post in the town. His battalion's war diary for the evening of December 15th recorded nothing unusual. Road conditions, supply notes, maintenance, schedules. The weather had been overcast and damp for days, the kind of bone-chilling cold that settles into the Ardennes in December and refuses to leave. Men played cards in their billets. Some wrote letters home. Others slept. Up at the junction town of Malmedy, several miles northeast of Trois Ponts, more of Pergrin's men were billeted after working on road repairs. At Werbermont, to the west, another company was running a sawmill operation, cutting lumber for winterization projects. Across the sector, similar scenes played out in similar ways. Engineers attached to infantry divisions were repairing culverts, clearing debris from supply routes, keeping the arteries of the Allied war effort open through the Belgian winter. Meanwhile, across the Our River, behind the Siegfried Line, Joachim Peiper was briefing his officers on their route of advance. The maps were spread on a table in a farmhouse somewhere in the Eifel. The route had been chosen for him, not by him, and he was not happy with it. The roads were too narrow, too winding, and too dependent on bridges over rivers with steep banks. He told his superiors the route was more suited to a bicycle than a tank column. He was told to make it work. He was 29 years old. He had been fighting continuously since the invasion of Poland in 1939. He was one of the most decorated and most feared armoured commanders in the German military. And on the morning of December 16, 1944, he had no idea that a handful of American engineers scattered across the Belgian countryside were about to determine the outcome of the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Neither did they. When the German guns opened fire at 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, the American front in the Ardennes fractured in multiple places within hours. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, was virtually surrounded before the first day was over. Two complete regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, were encircled and, over the following days, forced to surrender. Approximately 7,000 American soldiers were captured in what became the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theatre, the largest since the fall of Bataan in 1942. The 28th Infantry Division was hammered relentlessly along the Our River. The 99th Infantry Division in the north was pushed back under enormous pressure, though it would eventually hold a crucial ridge that would help doom the entire German plan. In the northern sector, the 6th Panzer Army committed Kampfgruppe Peiper as the tip of its spear. Peiper launched his column west on the evening of December 16th, moving through Honsfeld, then south through Bullingen, where his vehicles refueled from American fuel stores captured at the airfield. From there he drove toward Ligneville and then northwest toward Stavelot and the valley of the Amblev. He reached the high ground east of Stavelot at dusk on December 17th. Captain Lloyd Sheets of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had a command post near the Amblev Bridge and had laid mines across the road approaches. Peiper halted for the night, not certain of American strength ahead. It was a pause that would prove costly. At dawn on December 18th, Peiper attacked Stavelot and fought his way across the Amblev Bridge, which a detachment of the 202nd Engineer Combat Battalion had failed to destroy in time. He was through. He was moving again. But what came next would define the entire battle. 2 miles north of Stavelot, along the road through Francorchamps, was one of the largest Allied fuel dumps in Belgium. Over 2 million gallons of gasoline, the fuel Peiper desperately needed. Major Paul Solis of the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion ordered roughly 124,000 gallons poured into a road cut and ignited, creating a wall of fire across the Francorchamps road. Peiper never drove up that road. He never found the main dump. He continued west along the Ambleve Valley instead, burning fuel he could not replace, moving toward bridges he did not yet know were already being prepared for demolition ahead of him. At Trois Ponts, Major Robert Yates, the executive officer of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, had taken command of the engineer defense. His men had wired the bridges. Company C of the 51st, under Captain Sam Scheuber, was positioned on the east bank with a 57mm anti-tank gun and whatever small arms the engineers carried. Shortly after 11 in the morning on December 18th, Peiper's lead Panther appeared at the railway underpass east of the Amblev Bridge. The engineer's anti-tank gun opened fire. It did not stop the tank, But it bought 30 seconds, and 30 seconds was enough. Captain Scheuber's men blew the Ambleve bridge. The span dropped into the river as the German armour reached the bank. Peiper could see the far bank. He could see the road continuing west. The bridge was gone. He swung north toward Cheneux, looking for another crossing. He found one, but it cost him hours and fuel. While he was fighting his way around, a platoon of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, under First Lieutenant Albert Walters, had moved to the southern Sambre-Trestle Bridge southeast of Trois Ponts and wired it for demolition. Sergeant Jean Miller's squad held the bridge. In the afternoon, when German combat engineers were spotted approaching the bridge from the east, Miller waited. He let them come. He waited until they were on the span, and then he blew it. Peiper had now lost 3 bridges at Trois Ponts in a single day. He pushed west, along the Ambleve Valley toward Stoumont, then southwest toward the Lienne Creek crossing near Habiemont. His route was narrowing. His fuel was bleeding away. His timetable was already broken beyond recovery. At the Lienne Creek Bridge near Habiemont, a squad from Company A of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was waiting. The American engineers had been told German armour was coming. They had laid their charges. As Peiper's reconnaissance vehicles probed toward the bridge, the engineers blew it. The explosion echoed across the frozen creek valley. The bridge dropped. The road west was gone. It was at moments like this, according to the oral tradition of the 291st, that Pergrin recorded in his memoir, and that the historian Janice Holt Giles preserved in her 1970 account, that Peiper's fury at the engineers reached its peak. The phrase attributed to him, "those damned engineers," has not been found in surviving German interrogation transcripts. It appears in the American record as the sentiment of a trapped commander who understood exactly what had been done to him and by whom. Peiper himself, in post-war accounts, acknowledged repeatedly that the loss of bridges, not American firepower, had been the decisive factor in stopping his advance. By December 19th, Peiper was cut off. American forces retook Stavelot and blew the Ambleve Bridge there, severing his supply line from the east. He was deep in Allied territory, surrounded on 3 sides, out of fuel, blocked from the west, cut off from behind. His column, that had been meant to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours, was stranded at the village of La Gleize, in the hills above the Ambleve Valley, going nowhere. He stayed there for 5 days while his fuel ran out, and his ammunition dwindled, and American forces tightened the ring around him. Then, in the early hours of December 24th, Christmas Eve, Peiper received permission to break out on foot and abandon everything. He formed up roughly 800 survivors, left approximately 135 tanks, half-tracks, assault guns, and other armoured vehicles behind, and walked out through the forest in the dark. The password for the breakout column was Merry Christmas. He was back across German lines by Christmas night. Kampfgruppe Peiper was finished as a fighting force. The story of what the engineers stopped cannot be told honestly without accounting for what happened to the soldiers who were caught up in those same days. On December 17th, 1944, on the road south of Malmedy at a crossroads called Borgnez, a large column of American prisoners captured by elements of Peiper's column was marched into a field and shot. 84 American soldiers were murdered. Most were from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Some accounts place the total at 86, as additional bodies were recovered in outlying fields in the days that followed. The Malmedy Massacre, as it became known, was the worst atrocity committed against American prisoners of war in the European theatre. News of the killing spread rapidly through American units in the Ardennes. It had an effect that no German commander had anticipated. If there had been any inclination among exhausted American soldiers to pull back without a fight when overwhelmed, the news from Borgnez burned it away. Engineers who might otherwise have withdrawn from impossible positions instead set their charges and held their ground. Pergrin's men knew about Malmedy before the first bridge at Trois Ponts was blown. They knew what capture by Peiper column might means. The cost among the engineers was real. The 290 first suffered casualties during the battle from small arms fire and artillery. Captain Paul Kamen, the battalion's dental officer who had been doing a medical officer's work for weeks because necessity demanded it, survived the Ardennes, only to be killed on April 20th, 1945, when Luftwaffe jet aircraft strafed the 291st's convoy on the Autobahn in northern Bavaria, near Bad Kissingen, less than 3 weeks before the German surrender. On the German side, the human cost of what the engineers had done was measured in different but equally real terms. Peiper lost men to the small engagements at road junctions and bridge approaches. He lost irreplaceable fuel to every detour. He lost the operational coherence of his column as it was forced to thread through narrower and narrower routes under constant pressure. And ultimately, he lost his entire command, not to a pitched battle, but to exhaustion, denial, and the methodical work of men with explosives. After the war, Peiper was tried at the Dachau War Crimes Tribunal for the Malmedy massacre and sentenced to death by hanging. His sentence was commuted in stages, first to life imprisonment, then reduced to 35 years, and he was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956. He eventually settled in the village of Treves in eastern France under a version of his own name, translating documents and living quietly. On the night of July 13th to 14th, 1976, his house was firebombed. He died in the fire. The killers were never officially identified. After the war, when German commanders were interrogated and when they wrote their memoirs, a consistent frustration ran through their accounts of the Ardennes offensive. They cited Allied air power, which devastated German columns once the weather cleared after December 23rd. They cited the stubbornness of the American infantry. They cited logistics that were never adequate for what Hitler had demanded of his armies. And they cited, repeatedly and bitterly, the actions of American combat engineers. But this raises a question that deserves a direct answer. Why did the German plan not account more effectively for the near certainty that the Americans would destroy bridges ahead of an advancing enemy? The Germans had done it themselves on the Eastern Front for years. They had watched the Allies do it during the retreat from Normandy. Why Wacht was Rhine so dependent on capturing bridges intact? The answer is uncomfortable for the legacy of German military planning in the Ardennes. The first reason is the timetable itself. Hitler had set the parameters of the offensive, and they were not derived from a realistic assessment of what armoured columns could achieve on winter roads through river valley terrain. They were derived from what Hitler needed to happen for a strategic gamble to pay off. When the reality of ice, mud, narrow roads, and systematic bridge demolitions collided with the plan could not accommodate the collision. The timetable did not bend. And so German commanders found themselves cursing the engineers while trying to meet objectives that had become impossible within the first 12 hours. The second reason is that German combat engineers, the pioneer, were not positioned or resourced to rapidly replace the bridges being destroyed ahead of them. Heavy bridging equipment was scarce. River crossing operations require time even under ideal conditions, and the Ardennes in December 1944 was as far from ideal as conditions could be. While American engineers were destroying crossings in minutes, their German counterparts were measuring replacement times in days. The third reason, and perhaps the most significant, is that the German plan underestimated American adaptability at the junior officer level. German intelligence had developed a somewhat schematic view of how the American army responded to sudden crisis. They expected slowness. They expected units to wait for orders from above before taking independent action. What they encountered instead were lieutenants and captains commanding engineer platoons and companies who made rapid decisions to blow bridges, block roads, and hold junctions without waiting for instructions that might arrive too late or not at all. American military culture, in 1944, placed a genuine premium on initiative at the platoon and company level. The German plan had not adequately credited this. The result was that the northern route of the German advance, Peiper's route, the route on which the entire 6th Panzer Army's plan depended, became a bottleneck and then a trap. And the men who built that trap were engineers with explosives and the judgment to use them at exactly the right moment. The story of the engineers at Trois Ponts and along the Amblève Valley is not unique in military history. What happened in the Ardennes in December 1944 is part of a much older pattern, one that students of military history will recognize immediately once they start looking for it. At Kursk in July 1943, Soviet military engineers built one of the most sophisticated defensive systems in the history of warfare across the entire salient. Anti-tank ditches, minefields measured in millions of mines, reinforced strongpoints, carefully prepared killing grounds. When the German Operation Citadel struck, it struck not at a front line but at an engineered obstacle system designed to slow, channel, bleed, and ultimately stop armoured attacks. German tank commanders, who had been confident of breakthrough, found their formations being shredded in minefields that extended to depths they had not imagined possible. The offensive failed at staggering cost, and Soviet combat engineers were a central reason why. In the Pacific, American engineers' ability to construct functional airfields on islands that had been jungle days before changed the strategic balance in entire theaters within weeks of a landing. Guadalcanal's Henderson Field is the most famous example. Built by the Marines and then the Army's engineer battalions under fire, constantly repaired after Japanese bombardment, that airstrip became the reason Japan could not retake the island. Air power based at Henderson Field sank the ships and destroyed the reinforcements that Japan needed. Without the engineers, there is no Henderson Field. Without Henderson Field, there is no Guadalcanal victory. In World War I, German engineers' construction of the Hindenburg Line in the winter of 1916 to 1917 created a defensive system so formidable that the entire Allied strategy for the final 2 years of the war had to revolve around it. 3 years of offensive planning went into eventually breaching what German engineers had built in 4 months. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, French engineers' failure to destroy key rail junctions early in the campaign allowed Prussian armies to move and concentrate troops at a speed that French commanders could not counter. The fall of Napoleon III's regime was shaped in part by what engineers did not do in time. What all of these examples share is the same fundamental reality that the Ardennes engineers embodied in December 1944. Combat engineering is a force multiplier that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore once you start looking for it. A single bridge, destroyed at the right moment by the right hands, can stop an armoured division in its tracks. A single road blocked by felled timber and anti-tank mines can delay an advance by hours. And hours, in a battle fought to a timetable, are the difference between a plan that works and one that collapses. The German commanders who cursed the engineers in the Ardennes were, in the deepest sense, acknowledging something their own operational planning had failed to properly weigh. Engineering is not the tail of an army. In the right terrain, at the right moment, it is part of its teeth. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, when the last German forces were pushed back to their starting lines. It had been the largest land battle in the history of the United States Army. Roughly 610,000 American soldiers had been engaged. American casualties totaled approximately 75,000, killed, wounded, and captured. German casualties were estimated at between 60,000 and 100,000. For the German army, the offensive had consumed reserves that could never be replaced. The elite SS divisions, the fuel, the tanks, the ammunition that had been husbanded over months for this single throw of the dice, all of it was gone. When the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive opened on January 12, 1945, the Eastern Front had been stripped to feed the Ardennes assault. The Red Army's advance across Poland was devastating. Germany never regained the strategic initiative on either front. For the American combat engineers who had fought in the Ardennes, recognition came slowly. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions during the battle. Individual decorations were awarded to men whose work at specific bridges had been decisive. But the broader story of what the engineers accomplished was absorbed into the larger narrative of the Battle of the Bulge, overshadowed by the more famous stories of Bastogne, of the 101st Airborne Division, of Patton's drive from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin spent years after the war working to set the record straight. He co-wrote his memoir with Erich Hamel, published in 1989 under the title First Across the Rhine. It remains one of the most detailed accounts of combat engineering in World War II, written from the perspective of a battalion commander. Pergrin was direct in his assessment. The bridges his men destroyed were, in his view, the single most important contribution to stopping Kampfgruppe Peiper's drive on the Meuse. Without those demolitions, he believed Peiper would have reached the river. The historian Danny Parker, whose study of the Battle of the Bulge is among the most thorough produced by any researcher, reached the same conclusion. Hugh Cole's official United States Army history of the battle, published in 1965, and still the definitive scholarly reference on the campaign, gives detailed treatment to the engineer demolitions program and their operational significance. In Belgium, the memory of those days remains immediate in the towns of the Ardennes. At La Gleize, one of Peiper's abandoned King Tiger tanks still sits in the village centre outside the December 44 museum, where it has stood since shortly after the war. Local guides will tell you that the reason it ended up there, unable to advance, unable to retreat, simply abandoned in a Belgian village, is because of what happened at the bridges upstream. The bridges themselves were rebuilt long ago. Modern roads cross the same rivers at the same points, carrying tourist buses and farm lorries, unmarked by any special sign. But for anyone who knows the history, driving the Amblève Valley from Stavelot toward Trois Ponts, or standing at the Lienne Creek crossing near Habiermont, the terrain tells the story without words. The river banks are still steep, the roads are still narrow, a bridge is still the only way across, and anyone standing at one of those crossings in December, looking down at the cold, dark water below, you can understand in a moment why a handful of American engineers with explosives and the nerve to use them changed the course of the largest battle in American military history. Joachim Peiper reflected on the Ardennes campaign many times in the years after the war. His accounts are consistent on the central point. It was not the strength of American infantry that had stopped him, though that strength was real. It was not Allied air power, which had been grounded by weather for most of the critical days. It was the bridges. He had been close enough at Trois Ponts to see the far bank of the Amblève. He had been close enough at the Lienne Creek to hear the explosion before the smoke cleared. He had been close enough to the Meuse that his officers could almost calculate the distance on a map, and at every point where close became decisive, there had been engineers with explosives who got there first. One bridge, blown by men who were supposed to be building roads. This is the story that gets left out of most tellings of the Battle of the Bulge. It does not have a single dramatic headquarters moment around which a film can be built. There is no famous general's defiant response to an ultimatum. There is no hill that was held against impossible odds with a famous unit number attached to it. There is instead a pattern, repeated across dozens of crossings and road junctions in the space of 4 days, of ordinary soldiers doing something precise and consequential and irreversible, at the right moment, without waiting to be told. Lieutenant Colonel David Pergrin was 27 years old. He had no infantry units to call on, no armour and no artillery. He had engineers with demolitions experience, an intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the authority to act. He used all three. Captain Sam Scheuber of Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, watched a Panther tank approach his bridge and held his nerve until the last possible moment before giving the order. Sergeant John Miller of the 291st held a bridge southeast of Trois Ponts with a small squad and waited until German combat engineers were on the span before he pressed the trigger. These are not invented men. They are documented soldiers, in documented places, making documented decisions that changed the course of a battle, that changed the course of the war in the West. War has a tendency to remember the dramatic over the effective, the last stand over the quiet defense, the defiant speech over the detonator pressed in the dark, the famous name over the sergeant whose name appears in a unit history that almost nobody reads. The engineers of the Ardennes were anonymous in precisely that way. Their names are not household names. The bridges they blew carry no commemorative plaques. The roads they blocked do not appear on tourist maps of the battle. But the German commanders who cursed them understood their value with the helpless fury of men who had built an entire plan on speed and found themselves standing at a riverbank, staring at wreckage where a bridge used to be, watching their timetable die. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered as a story of American resilience, of an army that refused to break under an assault that should, by any reasonable calculation, have broken it. That story is true. But it is incomplete without the men who went to the bridges first, who acted without orders, who understood the ground and what it demanded of them, and who made the choices that gave the rest of the army the time it needed to recover. They were engineers. And Joachim Peiper, until the end of his life, never forgot them. Nor should we.